The year 1904, Japan launched a surprising and well-coordinated attack against forces of the Russian Empire in Port Arthur. Overly confident in Russian superiority, Tsar Nicholas II ordered his forces to immediately eliminate the enemy both on sea and on land. Without any strategic plan, Russia suffered one of the most humiliating and costly defeats in its history. In 1 year, Japan has proven to the whole world its technological and military power and forced the mighty Russian Empire to back down from its imperialistic ambitions in East Asia. For one side, the Russo-Japanese War is a story of operational brilliance. For another, a story of ignorance and poor leadership. What were the main forces that made Japan embark on the path of war? And how did it achieve such a decisive victory against an overwhelming enemy? First, let's look at the steps of expansion of the Russian Empire in the region. In 1847, Russia established a governor-general for eastern Siberia, whose office at Petropavlovsk acted as headquarters for the eastern and southern movements in the Far East. The Russians expanded their influence to the mouth of the Amur River, where they established a principal base, Nikolaevsk, substantially increasing their power in the region. The Russians reached the best natural harbor in the area, Vladivostok, in 1860. At about this time, Russia tried to force the Japanese off Sakhalin Island. This was accomplished, but at the expense of another territorial dispute. Russia finally acquired Sakhalin Island in exchange for the cession of the Kuril Islands to Japan in 1875. Tsar Nicholas viewed East Asia as an easy target for the expansion of his empire. In particular, he considered the Japanese inferior to Russians, a quote, yellow monkeys, who could not stand against the Russian Empire's army. Nicholas II himself is one of the most elusive individuals in Russian history. He was described as shy, fearful of controversy, indecisive, and deeply devoted to his family. Alexander Mosolov, who headed his court chancellery for 16 years, wrote that Nicholas, though intelligent and well-educated, never adopted a definite, energetic attitude and loathed making a decision in the presence of others. Sergei Witt, who served Nicholas and his father for 11 years as Minister of Finance, commented that the Tsar was a well-intentioned child, but his actions were entirely dependent upon the character of his counselors, most of whom were bad. The soft haze of mysticism that surrounded Nicholas was a significant factor at the very outset of the war. It, along with a great deal of administrative mismanagement, contributed to the outbreak of the war itself, for it caused the Tsar to misread completely the realities that he and his nation were confronting. Shortly before the Japanese attack, he assured Kaiser William that there would be no war because he did not wish it. Japan, on the other hand, had undertaken serious measures to reform its military and economy in the years preceding the war, realizing the whole seriousness of the situation they were in. The transformation of Japan from an isolationist feudal state into a vigorous modern power began in 1868 with the demise of the Tokugawa shogunate and the restoration of the Meiji emperor. The reforms of that era had been carried through with such dramatic speed that within a quarter of a century Japan was ready to assert itself against China. In its foreign policy, Japan aimed first at extending its authority into Korea, a state over which China had long claimed suzerainty. Its struggle with China for predominance in Korea gave rise to several crises, and finally, in 1894, to war. Japan, with its modernized army and navy, at once won a series of striking victories against the Chinese, who, in the Treaty of Shimonoseki, ceded to Japan the Kwantung Peninsula, on which Port Arthur stands, together with Formosa and the Pescadores Islands, and agreed to pay a heavy indemnity. Nevertheless, the Japanese triumph was not meant to last. Russia, for which Japan's presence in China and Korea, especially in the Liaotung Peninsula, had become an obstacle to expansion, concentrated its efforts on expelling Japanese forces from China and Korea. Russia perceived Japan as a potential, and maybe the most dangerous challenger to its interests in China. To this end, Russia formed an alliance with France and Germany, whose goal was to expel the Japanese from all the gained territories under the Shimonoseki Treaty. In April 1895, all three nations declared that Japanese possession of the Liaotung Peninsula represented an obstacle to peace and stability in the Far East, and recommended that Japan relinquish its rights there. The goal was not to restore justice, Each of the three nations had its own imperialistic interest and aimed to destabilize China by gaining control over its territories instead of Japan. The government of Japan, headed by Prime Minister Hirobumi Ito, decided to accept the recommendation and return control of the Liaotung Peninsula to China. Japan would not survive the war against three major global empires. The Japanese government reluctantly decided to abandon the Liaotung Peninsula, which had been obtained at the cost of a large number of Japanese soldiers' lives. This willful intervention by Russia, France, and Germany fueled resentment, particularly against Russia, which had obviously been, in Japanese eyes, the principal perpetrator of the Triple Intervention. It was in this episode that the Japanese experienced for the first time since the opening of their country the reality of the international power game. The Japanese people, whose nation had joined the Western-governed international club only 25 years before, now saw the cold reality of international relations, that the weak were the victims of the strong. Both the Japanese people and their government believed that the concessions gained through the Treaty of 1895 were lawful in light of current international custom, and further, had been bought with the blood of Japanese soldiers. But these gains were now negated and finally lost due to what seemed an absurd intervention of three nations. Moreover, the Japanese people were angered that their country was so weak that it had no choice but to accept the actions of the great powers. This quickly encompassed the nation. It did not take long for a strong hatred of Russia and a desire for revenge to grow in most Japanese minds. In 1896, Russia gained the right to build the East Qing Railway through Manchuria, a shorter route than the Trans-Siberian Railway. This was followed by Germany sending warships and troops to occupy Tsingtao. In 1898, Russia sent a fleet to Port Arthur and Tallinn to intimidate the Chinese government into a lease of the former at the tip of the Liaotung Peninsula. Russia gained the port and extended to it a branch line of the East Qing Railway. Thus, the Liaotung Peninsula, which was one of the major objectives of the Triple Intervention and had been a main concern as well, fell into the hands of Russia, a ringleader of the intervention. The growing Chinese nationalism against outrageous activities by Western great powers was transformed into a campaign to expel them. The campaign expanded rapidly into what became known as the Boxer Rebellion. 8 nations, including Britain, the United States, France, Russia, and Japan, sent troops to Beijing to put down the rebellion. As a part of this military campaign, Russia sent a large force to Manchuria, however. The force remained in the area even after the cessation of hostilities in Beijing. Manchuria was for all intents and purposes occupied by Russia in that year. Korean Peninsula was the next goal. If it fell into their hands, the Russians would gain substantial freedom of action in the Far East. Additionally, the security of Japan would be weakened. The independence of Japan itself could be seriously jeopardized. The Japanese government's options were to expel Russia from Manchuria by military means, or forestall a Russian invasion of the Korean Peninsula through a diplomatic treaty or an agreement with Russia. In the meantime, the Japanese government decided to build up national power, especially the military, in the quickest possible manner. The size of the Imperial Army was to be increased from 7 divisions to 13. The Imperial Navy program called for 104 new ships, including 4 battleships and 11 armored cruisers, to be completed between 1896 and 1905. By 1904, the new Japanese fleet was already slightly superior to the Russian Pacific Fleet. But the true Japanese advantage was the fact that Russia had to divide the Pacific Fleet into 2 forces, one at Port Arthur and the other at Vladivostok. In addition, most reinforcements from Europe would have to take the long route around the Cape of Good Hope, along which few ports would be available to them. The Japanese strategy in case of war was therefore to concentrate its fleet and engage divided Russian forces separately. Negotiations between Tokyo and St. Petersburg about their respective positions in Manchuria and Korea came to naught on the 6th of February 1904. Japan, fearing a Russian military build-up in Manchuria, severed diplomatic relations. 2 days later, on the night of the 8th of February, hours before Japan formally declared war on Russia, surprise attacks on Russian warships in Chemulpo and Port Arthur signaled the start of the Russo-Japanese War. Japanese military leaders coordinated the development of a cooperative, integrated plan by the Army and Navy, in which the roles of each were clearly defined and assigned. The Japanese First Army landed at Incheon on the Korean peninsula and then proceeded to Manchuria. The Second Army landed on the southern coast of the Liaotung Peninsula and likewise moved toward Manchuria, coordinating with the advance of the First Army. The Third Army landed on the Liaotung Peninsula with the goal of capturing Port Arthur. The Fourth Army landed on the northeastern coast of Pohai Bay and proceeded to Liaoyang, coordinating with the Second Army. As for the Imperial Navy, the first mission was to destroy the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur. It was crucial to eliminate Russian forces before the arrival of reinforcements. The main threat to Japan was the large Russian Baltic Fleet that could change the direction of the war. The Imperial Army tasked General Marisuke Nogi's Third Army to isolate, attack, and take the well-protected fortress of Port Arthur from land. Nogi's army started its campaign on the 26th of June, 1904, employing simple infantry assault tactics against the fortified defensive line that the Russians had built up in the surrounding mountains and hills. Unfortunately, General Nogi continuously repeated these brutal tactics, making his infantrymen easy targets for the Russian defenders, whose carefully prepared positions allowed a continual crossfire. Due to the inflexibility of General Nogi and his staff officers, and their overconfidence in the fighting spirit of the Japanese soldier, which was a long tradition of samurai, the Third Army suffered a tremendous loss of young soldiers. Nonetheless, the Third Army eventually conquered a key hill overlooking the harbor of Port Arthur, from which Japanese heavy artillery was able to bombard Russian ships and base facilities. Initially, the naval attack on Port Arthur did not result in any significant success, however. The Japanese managed to achieve one important objective: to enforce a blockade of the port. This meant that the Russian fleet was trapped in a massive, disadvantageous position and could not possibly break through the tight Japanese line. Meanwhile, the Third and Second Armies also caused serious psychological stress for the Russian leaders, whose nightmare was, of course, the complete closure of the port by land and sea. The incompetence and arrogance of the Russian command brought the Japanese what they wanted on the platter. Believing in the superiority of Russian forces, Tsar Nicholas commanded the Pacific Fleet to leave Port Arthur and engage with Japanese forces. Russian Fleet Command knew that it was a suicide and tried their best to communicate this to Moscow, but Tsar's opinion did not change. The quote of famous Russian artist at the time, Alexandre Benoit, speaks loud about overall Russian opinion about the Japanese and their forces. Just think, those impudent Japs, those yellow-faced monkeys, suddenly took it upon themselves to shin up the great mountain of the almighty Russian state, with its population of more than 100 million. Even then, I and many others developed a kind of pity for those reckless madmen. They would be destroyed in 2 ticks, nothing would remain of them. And if the war transferred to their islands, then you could say goodbye to their wonderful art, all their delightful culture, which I and my friends had so grown to love over the last few years. The delusion of grandeur was fatal for the Russian Pacific Fleet. After the escape attempt, the Russian fleet suffered severe casualties. 7 main battleships were destroyed with not a single Japanese ship being damaged. The remaining Russian ships returned to Port Arthur and later surrendered to Japanese forces. Thus, the main Russian naval force in the Far East, the Port Arthur Squadron, was totally incapacitated. The remaining Russian fleet in Vladivostok was of minor strength. It was tasked with coming to aid the main Russian force in Port Arthur. The Japanese Second Fleet had taken a station near the Tsushima Strait, a choke point where it could intercept the Russian group. On the morning of the 14th of August, the Japanese Second Fleet and the Russian Vladivostok force encountered each other east of Tsushima Strait. The Vladivostok force was destroyed, never to be revived for the rest of the war. By December 1904, the Russian Pacific Fleet was completely disabled, allowing Admiral Togo to bring his fleet back to Japan for rest, maintenance, and training. Port Arthur was fully occupied on the 2nd of January 1905 by Japanese land forces. On land, Japanese troops had also progressed. They had taken Dalian in June 1904, and by the spring of 1905 had conquered about half of South Manchuria. As the bad news from the war continued to arrive, Tsar Nicholas made an important decision concerning the future of the war. No decisive change in the fortunes of war now seemed possible unless Japan's command of the sea could be broken. Nicholas decided, therefore, to send the Baltic Fleet to the Pacific. With Admiral Rojdestvensky's fleet on the way, the Japanese had to prepare. Rozhestvensky's fleet reached the battle zone in East Asia after a chaotic voyage of 7 months. Japanese fleet positioned itself in the Tsushima Strait, where they would eliminate Russian maneuver capabilities. Despite obvious disadvantages, Russians proceeded to engage and fought in the strait between Korea and Japan on 27 and the 28th of May 1905. Parts of Russian warships were destroyed and others surrendered. Japan yet again did not lose a single ship and completely destroyed the largest fleet of the Russian Empire. Rozhestvensky ended up as a prisoner of war. The reaction in St. Petersburg and throughout Russia was profound. A shadow of gloom and consternation spread over the land. For the first time since war commenced, St. Petersburg was really moved. The Russians overestimated their own power, ignored that of Japan, and provoked the Japanese people. They did not study Japan or the Japanese people carefully. Because of the significant difference of power between the two nations, the Russians even thought that Japan would never opt for war, whatever the Japanese security concern was. Without sufficient knowledge of Japan, they first optimistically thought that war was not possible for Japan. Even in case of war, they felt, they could knock down the weak and barbarous Japanese forces at the first blow. The provoked and angry Japanese showed the baselessness of this thinking. Even after the war broke out, St. Petersburg considered it a sideshow, a matter for the local authority in the Far East. In the ensuing days after the Battle of Tsushima, events moved towards agreement on peace talks. Peace was mediated by the United States. Russian and Japanese negotiators met in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. At the peace accord signed on the 5th of September 1905, Japan and Russia promised to return Manchuria to China and to evacuate their troops within 1.5 years. An exception was made for the Liaodong Peninsula. Its lease was transferred to Japan. Port Arthur was renamed Ryojun. Further, Japan took over the southern section of the South Manchurian Railway, the line between Changchun and Port Arthur, including the coal mines which belonged to it, giving Japan control of that part of the region, where it proudly flew its own South Manchuria Railway flag. Both countries promised that the railways they operated in Manchuria would in the future only be used for commercial and industrial purposes, not for strategic military ones. Southern Sakhalin Island became Japanese. Both countries promised to build no fortifications on their part of the island. President Theodore Roosevelt won a Nobel Peace Prize for his successful efforts in bringing the war to a close. The Treaty of Portsmouth effectively ended Russia's expansionist East Asian policy, directed toward establishing hegemony over the whole of Asia. Furthermore, the humiliating defeat at the hands of an Asian power that had until so recently been pre-industrial and isolationist added to the national anger and disgust. Within 2 months, the Revolution of 1905 compelled Nicholas II to issue the October Manifesto, which ostensibly transformed Russia from an unlimited autocracy into a constitutional monarchy. Japan, on the other hand, formalized its hold on Korea by forcing Kojong, the final monarch of the Chosun dynasty, to abdicate in 1907. Korean language and culture were violently suppressed, and Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910. Russo-Japanese War gave Japan room to achieve its imperialistic ambitions and come to a position of equal power with the European empires. It was an important global conflict that tested many of the new military technologies and gave valuable lessons in military planning and organization ahead of the First World War.